Welcome, age of vintage society. Alan Ladd, although was a star, didn't feel like one. His talent continued to be dogged by insecurities that were not completely of his making. Why, studios wanted to change Alan Ladd at any cost. I want you to know, my viewers, how much I appreciate you. Without your support, these videos wouldn't be possible. Thank you for those who hit the thanks button. What we have come to realise is, in the end, what matters most is how we perceive ourselves. A person could have everything in the world and still not see those things that they have. No one is immune from this feeling. It is subtle and creeps on a person before finally having that person in a chokehold. As we said, no one is immune, not even Hollywood stars. They are the most vulnerable when it comes to deep feelings of insecurity, and in this, Alan Ladd takes the icing on the cake. He was a small man, both in height and how he perceived himself. He felt everything he was propped up by the powerful publicity machinery of Paramount, the studio he had the most brilliant run of his career. They enabled his insecurity even if they didn't intend to. Alan felt insecure about his capacity as an actor, his looks, and his life. It was as if everything Paramount did was to affirm that he should feel insecure about these things. First, his hair had to go, and it wasn't only his hair that they took exception with. The studio had blonde stars, but for their main man, who was to play gangsters and villains, blonde hair was unneeded. The studio dyed his hair black because of a film, and the film became a hit among people, so the black hair had come to stay. This deepened the feelings of insecurity that Alan had about his looks. However, that wasn't all. The studio felt, as Alan was, he couldn't sustain his stardom, and they created the life they wanted him to portray to the public. This meant that Alan, who had become the public's sweetheart, despite playing the role of a villain, had to become squeaky clean. Paramount's script erased his only child from his first marriage. The studio felt the public would consider it a scandalous affair that their baby-faced actor had a child already. The guilt of keeping his child away from the public ate the star up inside, but he continued to play to the whims of the studio, anything to keep him relevant and not out of a job. But when the public later found out, they had no issue about the star having a child. Compared to the scandals that other stars faced, Alan's was pretty tame. It was a child, so what? For Alan, his guilt could only compound. His fear of losing his job turned out to be unfounded. Alan did what the studio recommended, as after his mother's death he considered the studio to be an extension of his family. It was this feeling that didn't make the star fight more when he wanted to get better roles. He was typecast in a certain type of role, and he just rolled with it for the most part. The studio only cared about cashing in on their star, and they made quite the sum from their star man. It was business from Paramount, and the studio sought to play safe and prevent him from taking a complex role that could ruin his popularity. It wasn't the studio that was criticised for this limitation of Alan Ladd, but the actor himself. Critics called him a movie star and not an actor. If you are wondering about the difference between the two words, a movie star was someone who had a career as a result of looks than talent. Alan had more than enough looks. His chiselled face made the audience swoon with adoration. Already Alan longed to become more than he was, and with these criticisms he accepted he was nothing more than just a guy who fortune mistakenly favoured. He didn't even think he had a pretty face. He said, "I have the face of an ageing choir boy, and the build of an undernourished featherweight. If you can figure out my success on the screen, you're a better man than I." The man was so completely devoured by his insecurity that he erased everything positive about him. It wasn't that there were people who didn't think well of his acting. The actor was credited for helping to revolutionise on-screen bad guys. They said he brought a fresher perspective to being an on-screen villain. People originally felt repulsed by villains, but Alan changed that. He showed Hollywood villains could be clean and also be tragic. But this wasn't enough. For Alan, nothing was enough, not even himself. So when the opportunity came for the superstar to show his mettle as an actor, he had bought into the negativity around his talent so much that he radiated it. He had accepted that he was untalented, and rather than show enthusiasm for this role, which would have kept his critics quiet, he showed fear. It was the lead in The Great Gatsby, a part many top stars would do anything to lay their hands on. It fell on Ladd's lap, and he said he wouldn't be able to do it because he wasn't a good actor. The studio had him do it, but they weren't confident in him. Their lack of confidence must have been shown because the film was a flop. It had mixed reviews, and it further dented how Alan saw himself. It affected a couple more of his performances. The only thing he could do right was playing smooth operating villains, but the studio wanted a bit of flair. They wanted his characters to become passionate. Alan couldn't portray a passionate person. It was not surprising, honestly. One could only portray passion from a place of confidence. Alan was far too rigid in what he felt safe doing that there was no space for evolution. Alan remained as he was, each of his waking days spent drowning deeper in his insecurity till he became lost, not fully enjoying what it meant to be a star. The man didn't even know he was one. "I never saw him get caught up in fame," Alan's son said in an interview. How could Alan be caught up in what he felt he didn't deserve? Paramount's marketing prowess may have led Alan Ladd to a bottomless rabbit hole of feeling insecure, but they weren't the ones that created the feeling in him. The events that led Alan Ladd to become the star that wasn't a star started just 4 years after his birth on September 3rd, 1913, in Hot Springs, Arkansas, US. That incident was his father's death, and it happened right in front of him. Another disaster set in not long after, as Ladd burned their apartment down by accident while he was playing with matches. This would be the beginning of the accidents that Alan would become known for. He once hurt his hand on the set of a film, and while shooting another film, the star slipped in the shower and broke his rib. Although some of his accidents led him to good fortune, after all, it was an accident that led him to become an actor, but before then he and his family suffered. After Ladd burned down their apartment, he and his mother, along with her new husband, moved. Their destination was California, and it wasn't a warm journey. Sometimes the family wouldn't be able to eat while travelling, and the good life they thought they would find in California didn't come quickly. Alan especially suffered in California. He was a malnourished boy with a small stature, which made him easy pickings for his new classmates. They called him Tiny as a result of his stature, which belied his older age. Ladd was the oldest in the class, and he was so academically uninclined as the travelling hurt his schooling, but he coped. The hurtful words got to him, and it was one of the incidents that made the star aware of how he looked. However, he tucked it all away and doubled down. Later things turned around for him. At least it did for a while, as another traumatizing event waited. Alan filled out his body a bit and became proficient at swimming, winning different awards. He thought about trying out for the Olympics until an accident happened. While trying to dive into the pool, Alan hit his head and subsequently quit swimming. Sometimes we wonder what could have been if the star hadn't given up on his swimming dream. The star, as we mentioned earlier, had a thing for accidents, and when he got his first job as a crew member, he had another one. While working, he fell off a scaffold, and the feeling of déjà vu made him quit on the spot. But before the incident, he was inspired by Errol Flynn's acting. So, rather than leave the entertainment industry entirely, Alan only left the crew to become a member of the cast. His choice looked like the wrong one initially, as studios didn't want anything to do with the actor. Why the rejection, you wonder? His looks. Studios at the time felt Ladd didn't have the looks that would go well with a camera. They said he was too blonde, and even Universal Pictures, who wanted to take a chance with him, dropped him like a hot potato because of his looks. Pity that his talent wasn't in consideration, and throughout his career his talent would always be secondary. Again the star became even more aware of how he looked, and later interviews show his pure resentment for his looks. In an iconic interview, when the interviewer asked Alan what he would change about himself, the actor revealed he would change everything about himself. As usual, despite how Ladd felt at the criticism of his skin and hair, he wasn't about to give up. Straight to acting school he went. The man looked for money to enroll himself and get better at acting. He didn't have a good start, as his teacher was critical of him. The teacher called his voice too high and Ladd too quiet. The star decided to change what was imperfect about him and began to train his voice to have full control over it. After a lot of hard work, he had great mastery over his voice and found a voice acting job on the radio. This dose of positivity was what he needed in his life, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough. His marriage to his first wife had been on the rocks since they got married, hovered at the edge, and eventually crashed. His mother, who like Alan suffered many tragedies, had become an adventurer of sorts, always looking for something at the end of a beer bottle. Lad didn't think his mother was in trouble and even funded her alcoholism, and so he funded her death. The boyish-looking man gave his mother money thinking she wanted to use it to binge on alcohol, but instead she took poison. Alan discovered her dead body at the back of his car. The guilt that he had a hand in his own mother's death piled on him. Also, with his wife gone, he felt truly alone. But he dragged himself to continue. The man continued his impressive display on radio, and the brilliance of his performances led him to Sue Carroll. Sue, who was a former actress during the era of silent films, met with the star and signed him to her agency. Sue had clout in the industry, and she used everything at her disposal to ensure that Lad would get the best part. But Sue hid a secret. She had fallen in love with Alan. It didn't matter to her that she was 10 years older than the man. Eventually the two married, and their marriage coincided with when Alan had his breakout role in This Gun for Hire. The film was one of his earliest pairings with Veronica Lake, the leading woman that paired the best with Alan. For Paramount it was less costly to let Lad and Lake appear together. It wasn't because of any over-the-top on-screen chemistry, but because of Alan's height. Standing at 5'6", Alan was considered short. He wasn't the only short star, but his thin build made him look extra small. Veronica was 4 feet tall, which meant even when she wore heels, Alan was still taller than her. However, when he shared the screen with other stars, Paramount tried every trick in the book to make him look taller. Sometimes they would angle the camera in such a way that Alan would appear taller than he was. Other times the crew would have to either raise where Alan stood while shooting or dig holes for his other stars to stand in. Paramount couldn't have their menacing smooth bad guy be short, so they began a campaign for Alan positioning himself as a tall man. The publicity only worsened Alan's insecurity, and he felt like a fraud. As a result, he became even more aloof both from the public and his fellow stars. Alan couldn't cope with the disappointed looks on the faces of fans who wanted to meet him for the first time. They expected someone taller, not the short man before them. However, despite his aloofness, he managed to form deep connections, and one happened because of his prone-to-accident nature. William Bendix accidentally knocked Alan out cold on the set of one of the many films that he and Lad paired in. Bendix was remorseful and repeatedly apologized to the short actor. Alan was touched, and the two grew to become best friends to the point that they bought houses near each other. But their friendship didn't last. Sue got in the way. Sue Carroll made a thoughtless comment about Bendix not serving in the army. It was interesting that she made the statement considering her husband couldn't complete his service due to digestive issues. The matter exploded to the point that Lad had to choose between his wife and friend. He and Bendix parted ways until they reconciled 10 years later, their bond stronger than ever. Perhaps if work didn't take Bendix away for longer periods, Alan would have lived longer. At the point when Alan spiraled, he relied on Bendix, but Bendix wouldn't be around. Another bond that Alan formed was an extramarital one. The actor had an epic affair with his on-screen wife, June Allison, in the film The McConnell Story. The man who execs at Paramount felt was unromantic managed to have a solid chemistry with another woman. We believe Alan found a part of himself he didn't even know he had. Rumours suggested he was ready to give it all up for June. But it wouldn't be. June wasn't in love, or rather she wasn't ready to leave her husband and children for Alan. The two denied the affair, and Alan's heartbreak was just beginning. The actor had a fallout with Paramount, which had him suspended for 3 months. He got what he wanted, which was an increased salary, but Paramount wouldn't loan him to other studios. Shaken by the experience, Lad was just happy to get his job back, but he would later leave the studio when he got a big money offer. At the time he had already reached the peak for Paramount, and their protection of him had reduced. Switching to Warner turned out to be a wrong choice for him. It didn't help that after Shane, Ladd's last movie with Paramount, which was successful, Paramount released some poor flicks Ladd featured in the hopes to make more money. Their selfishness devalued Ladd, who would soon become an independent agent. Becoming independent made things worse, as Ladd missed out on some opportunities because he felt they weren't good enough for him. His woes began to compound, and he followed his mum's footsteps. He began to drink, and added to his alcohol dependence were pills to help him sleep. He almost slipped into an eternal sleep when he was met in a pool of his blood with a bullet lodged in him. He claimed his house was invaded by thieves, and he got his gun to scare them off, but ended up slipping and accidentally shooting himself. For people who didn't know him, it was a plausible story. Accidents happen, and Ladd was very prone to accidents after all. For those who knew him, Ladd lied. The man was deathly afraid of a gun. He couldn't have picked one to hunt thieves. But sadly, those that suspected didn't do much to monitor Alan, as 2 years later after the incident Alan died. The star was said to have accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills mixed with beer. In the end, accidents that trailed him all his life claimed him, using his insecurities as fuel. The star was survived by his wife and sons, who would later become top men in Hollywood. You see, even if you're famous, you still have a lot of insecurities. How about other icons? This is the video you have to check. James Arness, the making of a Western icon.